and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, cultural history is very much on the front line during the culture wars we've been seeing over the past few months. So I'm delighted that this week my guest is the author Dr. Philip Kiszely, who lectures in cultural history at the University of Leeds. Philip, thank you very much for coming.
Great to be here, Peter. Thank you.
I want to start with one very particular thing. You wrote an article for Spiked Online recently, and it was about the statue situation, which obviously we're very preoccupied with here. But you said in it towards the end that we were at a sort of tipping point. Yeah. Can you expand on that a bit?
Well, I think what I was talking about in the article was the idea of history and actually what history is, and simplistic heroes and villains versions of history, which I think throughout the summer we got, which were narratives which were racialised, which were identitarian, which were about dividing people rather than kind of uniting people. And it feels as though we've come to a point, I think, in discourse and in intellectual thought generally, as well as the broader culture, where we either stand up against that and say, actually, this is just too simplistic. This isn't our history. This isn't what our history is all about. Yes, we had the evil of slavery, but we also abolished slavery. Yes, there's Colston, but there's also Wilberforce. So the history of Britain is a complex and multi-layered narrative. If we emphasise that that's the case, and if we take on this simplistic narrative, this identitarian narrative, then I think we can push back, and I think we can say, there are more and more people doing it. There are more and more people saying, "What? Hang on, yes, we've had this identitarian kind of discourse for a long time, but it is simplistic." But it's not only simplistic. I think people are beginning to see for the first time, that it's doing more harm than good. If you racialise everything in the name of anti-racism, you get racism because people are obsessed with race. If you tell white people that they're inherently evil because of the colour of their skin or their history, which is linked to the colour of their skin, then that can't be good in the long run. So I think these identitarian tropes, these identitarian don't get me wrong, they're incredibly deeply embedded in our young people and in our middle-aged kind of people as well. They're there, but people are beginning to question them, I think, in a way that they haven't done before, and I think they're thinking about racism and how to deal with racism in different ways. I don't think people have got the answers yet. Okay, because if I was coming on here and saying, I've got the answer to racism, it'd be fantastic. But I think people are thinking, actually, this isn't working. And so if there's a tipping point, I'm not sure I like that word, but if there's a potential time for change, maybe it's now. Okay, and maybe it's people thinking about narratives that bring us together. I think Roger Scruton used to talk about that a lot. That kind of that collective pronoun, the we. What does that mean? Actually, what does that mean? The we. We instead of I. And what does that mean in in a nation state?
This you say that's embedded. It certainly is. It seems to be intensifying, though. I mean, in your academic career, have you seen it become more intense?
It's always been there. It's I started my degree in the mid-90s, the early to mid-90s, and then I did an MA, and then I did a PhD. I've always been involved with culture and the performing arts and acting, theatre, television, film. That's kind of my area. It's always been there. because that was the period when it developed. Really, I think the key book that other people have come onto this show and talked about is Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, but there are others as well. I think that came out in 1990 or 1991. So that was at the time when this kind of thought, these kind of ideas were emerging. But they've been around in kind of various forms since the 60s, I think, really. But they didn't have the kind of currency they've got today, and they didn't have the force that allows them to take everything else out and obliterate, everything that stands in their way. When I started teaching, which was round about the 1999, yes, these ideas were there, and some of them were quite useful. But as time has gone on, you get the sense, and it's not just in academia; it's in the broader culture as well, that these ideas have not only kind of expanded and become dominant, they're now actually sacrosanct. So if you I suppose like we're doing now, and like you always do on this show, if you take on the identitarian kind of narrative, then you're placing yourself outside of the mainstream now, which is ironic because these ideas started as radical ideas, as ideas that were different. They still characterise themselves as radical ideas, but they are actually very much the mainstream, as we see, and again, as other people have said on this show. It's part of business, it's part of finance. Yes, it's part of education, it's certainly part of culture, but it's generally part of everything we do now. We think in identitarian terms. So yes, it's become much stronger. It's become a force that is wielded often in a very cynical way.
How do you mean cynical?
Well, I mean, if you don't toe the party line in some of these ideas, then you get cancelled, and we see that all the time. Now, I'm not talking about, we all want equality, and we all dislike racism, and we all think Black Lives Matter. I've never met anyone who doesn't. It's not that. We all agree on that. We're all on the same page. The problem is the method. The problem is you're not allowed to speak because you're a white cisgendered male, and and I'm not allowed to speak because I'm the same, and I have all of this privilege that puts me on the debit side of the ledger, whereas other people have victimhood points that and it's this kind of moving up and down, which is used really cynically. That idea of privilege and victimhood is used cynically. I mean, we've seen just in the last few weeks, we've seen the academic in America who was claiming black ethnicity. To
a white person who's
was claiming black ethnicity and performing this, and you have to ask yourself why.
When in your particular discipline, I mean, or actually in the academic world generally, what has been the effect if you do not entirely go along with it? If you make it known that you don't go along with it? I mean, we're hearing more and more stories of academics coming under attack, either from the students or indeed, from their fellow academics. I mean, is this something you've experienced? I mean, or do you feel, in your particular approach to these things, in your beliefs, that somehow, you're besieged, that you are alone?
It's a really good question. I could give a really simplistic answer. I'm not going to. I don't feel as though I'm alone. I don't feel as though I'm besieged, but I do feel as though my approach to history, my approach to culture, my approach to the performing arts is a an approach that is a kind of minority approach. So the way I deal with history, I kind of do not engage with identitarian jargon at all. And so the currency of academia is the peer-reviewed journal article. Essentially, that's what we do.
The peer-reviewed journal.
Peer-reviewed journal article. So we write journal articles. That's our research. We present our research in journal articles and books. And yeah, I mean, my peer reviews come back glowing, obviously. But when they do come back, they tend to say this is refreshingly free of jargon.
Right.
So that tells me a couple of things, right? That tells me that, okay, I'm doing something different, but it also tells me I'm not the only one, and I'm not the only one who appreciates this. So I'm in a minority, certainly, but I think there are lots and lots of other academics out there who feel the same, who feel that, maybe there are other ways of looking at culture, maybe there are other ways of looking at relationships between the sexes, looking at race and ethnicity, looking at sexuality, and doing all of those things, because they're all interesting things. We're not going to stop looking at them, but if we look at them in different ways, then who knows, it might be more productive. And if we historicise those inquiries in empirical, proper ways, then it really will be productive.
But how do you do that, and what are the chances of doing that in the current climate? I mean, the thing is, if this is all sort of embedded and it goes across all disciplines, it's not just the humanities anymore, it's science, I mean, how does one let's say fight back, but how does one re-establish a different approach when things are so embedded?
Well, I'm involved with a campaign called Don't Divide Us.
Don't Divide Us.
Don't Divide
Us,
right,
okay.
DDU, which is a kind of broad-ranging campaign which came about after the George Floyd death. And there are a number of academics, myself included, who are involved with that, who say, actually, there's got to be a different way to deal with racism. There's got to be a different way to deal with relations between the sexes. There's got to be a different way to deal with sexuality. And the clue's in the title, I suppose. It's called Don't Divide Us. And there are a number of us, and we meet every week online, but we meet every week, and we talk about how we're going to do this, and we're taking action. We're kind of lobbying. And we're thinking about innovative ways of dealing with the past, certainly, which is what most of us are interested in, but also the present as well, and thinking about how that culture works.
Who's sort of involved in it? I mean, are they different political views?
Yeah. It's not it isn't a left or right thing. And I think with lots of this as well, it isn't something that people who are, do I want to say identitarian, people who want to problematize, to use one of their words, identity politics. Many people probably think, oh well, they're right leaning, and maybe lots of them are, but there are lots of people from the left as well who find the idea that you're only allowed to talk about your lived experience.
Yeah, well, what is lived experience? What's unlived experience? Isn't that the very nature of experience? Lived experience.
It's this idea of standpoint, isn't it? So
yes.
I think it relates, in a way, without getting kind of too complex, it relates to the idea of categories of knowledge being broken down in a kind of postmodern way. And so if you kind of take knowledge as being relative, okay, rather than absolute, and truth as being relative rather than absolute, then the idea of lived experience is as important as anything else. The idea of the subjective becomes really quite important. So the problem with that, of course, is that it can go absolutely anywhere. My subjective experience at the moment might be that, you're questioning me too hard. You're not, but, you're questioning me too hard. And then, I might think, well, is it something about me that's wrong here? And maybe I'm going to complain about you. And maybe I'm going to kind of take that further. And maybe I'm going to try and stop you earning. You can see where it goes. I'm not saying that happens all the time, and I'm not saying there's nothing to subjective lived experience. There is, but it's how it's framed in a broader notion of knowledge, I think is really interesting and potentially really problematic. Well, not potentially problematic, it is problematic.
But it's also very narcissistic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Everything is seen through the kind of prism of oneself.
But I mean, sorry, Peter, just to pick up on that point, because I think it's interesting, the idea of the self, and the individual being at the centre of things is part of it. But ironically, the self is always subjugated to the group identity. And the group identity is always the most simplistic thing. So you're grouped by race, you're grouped by gender, you're grouped by sexuality, and my sexuality is probably really important to me, who I am as a person. It's not the only thing, My childhood is probably really important. My class is probably really important. Class, he said there with a very flat A, but
This is actually class. Sorry, class with a long A.
That's the difference, you think. That's the difference between us.
Class is entirely missing from all of this, isn't it? When you talk about identitarian politics, when you talk about Black Lives Matter protests, whatever it is, class does not seem to play a part in this, does it?
No, or it does in a way that is just an adjunct, so it's kind of thrown in an intersectional way. It's one of those things. Oh, it's another ingredient. This is another ingredient of victimhood. But I think class is really important. And just to come back very quickly, I know we've already talked about it, but just to come back to the point about left and right, I think that's one of the reasons why lots of people on the left think that the identitarian turn has been a problematic one because of that very thing, because it kind of takes class out of the system and out of the system of thought, and of course class is really important. Region is really important. If you're talking about lived experience, then where you're from and your family and your upbringing are just as important as your sexuality and your ethnicity, I would suggest.
But I would agree with that totally. Your context, your physical context, where you grew up, where you're from. But that would tend to someone has defined that, David Goodhart, as being a somewhere. You're a somewhere or an anywhere.
Yes.
In other words, if you're a somewhere, locality means an awful lot to you. By implication, by extension, the country means a lot to you. Are you a somewhere or an anywhere?
No, I'm a somewhere.
Right.
I'm a somewhere. But I mean, I don't live where I was born and brought up. But that's I can't, because I work somewhere else, and maybe, perhaps, I wouldn't want to stay in the same place all my life, but I'm very much rooted in where I'm from, and I'm kind of northern as well. You can hear it in every word I say. But the idea that my past is important to me and my context is important to me absolutely kind of plays out in everything I do, and the somewheres and anywheres thing works on various levels. You've already said that about kind of nation, but it feeds into the kind of Brexit Remainer debate and all of those other things, which again you've talked about on this show an awful lot. And I think it's important, and I think as well, this is probably a bit of a generalisation, but I'm going to say it anyway because there's probably something to it. The somewheres are going to be much more conservative when it comes to identity politics and all the ideas around that, and the others, the anywheres, is that what you call them? They will probably be much more receptive to that, primarily because they're thinking in different kinds of categories. So the self and the identity is framed in a whole set of different categories which aren't rooted. And I think that's the key thing. They are very much not rooted. Maybe race is probably the one that stands out there, but the others are very fluid. You know, they're all about transgression.
I mean, you are a lecturer in cultural history, right? So, as you mentioned, you know, the performing arts, film. You've written about this. I mean, for example, you wrote about the way that empire was treated in 1970s drama, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, for example, which I find fascinating. I wonder, Philip, what do you see if you look at the drama today on television and similar? What will it tell us looking back? If you were writing in the future, looking back, what will it tell us about the state we're in at the moment, or what will it tell us about our preoccupations at the moment?
God, that's a good question. I'll answer it in relation to one show, and that was A Christmas Carol at Christmas.
Right.
I don't know whether you saw it.
Yes, I did indeed.
Yeah. I wouldn't ordinarily watch it, but you know, you're with family and you're bullied into doing these things. You know, I'd rather go upstairs and kind of watch Man at the Top from the 70s or something. But so I watched the show, and I watched about a good more than an hour of it. I watched about an hour of it, and at that time, within that hour, the Victorian kind of infirmary had kind of 24 hours to save it before it was going to go. The tenement was burning a la Grenfell House, and someone actually said, for the many and not the few. Someone actually said, for the many and not the few. So I would suggest, which was the Labour
slogan,
tagline for the election. So I would suggest that tells you everything you need to know. It's we have this kind of not all drama, but lots of drama. The kind of drama that I've just illustrated is almost like a kind of a bad writing workshop for second-rate wokeness.
Yeah.
And there's a sense that all of these things are just shoehorned into everything. And so if there's, you know, political dramas, then they're from a very definite perspective. If there are historical dramas, they're not really about the past. Now, the historian E.H. Carr said, great history is as much about the present as it is about the past. But much of the stuff that you see on TV and much of the stuff that you see on film actually just are not about the past at all. It's the present dressed up in fancy dress that might be 19th or 18th century or the 1920s, but it is fundamentally now.
I think people do feel that. I mean, you feel when you're watching BBC drama now, or actually most drama, that in fact you're getting a certain message. I mean, with Christmas Carol, I thought that was a sort of landmark in that way for the reasons you've just said, but there were also other things about it. I mean, Scrooge himself was no longer just a curmudgeon. He was sort of like an arch capitalist. They dragged in the collapse of a mine. Bob Cratchit's family were mixed race, you know, and it was just about everything. And you look at it and think, surely, if you write that if you want, but just don't be a parasite on someone else's work from the past.
I mean, there is that, and that's a really, really good point. But the other point is, and this feeds into lots and lots of research, and I'll give you an example in a minute. But the other point is, it's kind of quite boring because you know exactly what's going to happen, and you know exactly where the angle's going to be, the agenda's going to be. And I'll just give you an example. I'm on an editorial board for a series of books, and it's a fairly new series, so we're getting quite a few proposals for books in, and I just read one the other day, and it was an identitarian take on horror, the horror genre on television, and I didn't need to read the all of the proposal to know exactly what the findings were going to be in the final chapter. So there's a sense of, okay, you're going to do all of this research, but really, you know precisely what your findings are going to be. So there's not a huge amount of point in doing the research. Research should be a you know, God, it's a hideous cliche, I shouldn't say it really, but a voyage of discovery. You're looking for new knowledge. And it feels as though lots of work, not all, you know, I'm not kind of just saying everybody else's research is dreadful and mine's brilliant, but not, you know, not at all. But it seems that, you know, lots of research within the parameters of, you know, the identitarian, it is by its very nature going to come out with the same things over and over again. And so for me, actually, going back to why should we change things and how should we change things? Okay, that's why we should change things. Okay, we know a lot of this. And I'm not saying that some of it isn't true. You know, there is racism and there is sexism, and we do need to change some things. But that's not the only story. If you're looking at history, for example, and you're only looking for racism, and you're only looking for sexism, and you're only looking for transphobia, my God, you're going to find it, but you're going to find it anywhere. You can also find other things. You can also find other things. And I think that's one of the reasons why we should be looking at other methodologies. We should be looking at other subjects, and we should be thinking broader. And lots of people are, but I think there should be more people doing it.
On this point, you know, BAFTA, the British Academy, and indeed the Academy in America, Academy of Motion Pictures, they have both adopted new criteria to get nominated, right? In if you're making a program or a drama or something, you have got to show certain things, usually to do with all along identity lines, either in front of the camera or behind it. I mean, does this not have a profound effect even on the very idea of creativity? If this is what if this is the main thing, or rather, if you're not going to get nominated unless you do that, then it entirely thwarts the real idea of free creativity, doesn't it?
I think it's a really good example of why a lot of this stuff comes from a good place. Okay, it's about, you know, wanting equality of opportunity, but somewhere along the line, it becomes an absolute rigid kind of, you know, a rigid definition of equality of outcome.
Equality of outcome.
Yeah, and I think those two things are very different things, and the idea of equality of outcome, I think you're absolutely right, is going to impact massively on the kinds of drama that we're looking at on all media, on radio, on television, on film, and there is going to be all of these things that we've just talked about. So there is going to be, you know, a very definite set of issues that are going to be have to be addressed in every single thing you see, and they're going to relate to the identities of the people who are involved, and that idea of flattening, that idea of reducing drama, history, culture to race, sex, sexuality, identity. It's all we ever talk about. And I'm interested in it. Don't get me wrong, I am interested in it, and I'm not entirely against some quotas, but I just want the field to open up. I want academia, I want the arts, I want culture to be a marketplace of ideas, and I think that's what it should be. And I'm not necessarily sure it is at the moment.
Well, I don't think it has been for quite a long time, actually, particularly in Britain. The point is, you know, you say that these things dominate now, and I think people pick it up. They pick it up in the simplest things, and this goes with the BBC, actually. You know, people think BBC bias is about the news. It's actually not. It's about the assumptions behind their drama and comedy and everything. If you look at what the stage we're at the moment, we've had COVID, we've got theatres that are dark, we've got movie theatres that are not doing very well. We've had that, and then we've had the Black Lives Matter thing, and then we've had this cultural onslaught. I mean, when we emerge from this, whatever, whenever we do, it's looking more and more distant at the moment. What is our culture going to look like? I mean, will it be just drenched, as I think it will be, in identity politics even more? I mean, if you're a cultural historian and you also lecture in performance, which you do, what is the impact going to be of this extraordinary time, do you think, broadly?
It's a difficult question, and I can't see into the future. But I could look at the past, and what I thought when this started, and I think I think lots and lots of other people thought this, and I think Douglas Murray's even come on this show and said this, that with COVID, with something potentially so huge and game-changing, all of this stuff would go out of the window, and it didn't. I think people have hunkered down, and the identitarian impulse has become even stronger. I would suggest. I think we're going to spend an awful long time coming to terms with COVID in various ways. Mind you, having said that, I would have said at the beginning of this year, there's going to be an awful lot more about Brexit, but COVID came out of nowhere. So there are always lots of kind of, ifs and buts around this kind of thing. But we're going to spend an awful long time coming to terms with COVID. But if the last 2 or 3 months are anything to go by, we're going to come to terms with COVID as COVID in relation to sex, COVID in relation to race, and COVID in relation to kind of gender. There are lots and lots of other stuff in between, which arguably is probably more important in terms of the culture at large, what is going to happen there. And my guess is very few people will take that on. Because that's actually really, really complex, right? How are we going to kind of interact with each other in a year's time when, let's say for most of this year, we've been interacting primarily on screen. That's really going to impact on our relationships with people, on our relationships with places. I mean, we're in central London here, and I just walked through central London. It's still quiet. Oh,
it's like a ghost town, actually.
So all of those things which relate to culture, which relate to the economy, but which relate to us as people and us as three-dimensional living beings are really important things to come to terms with. And my fear is that we're just going to go down the same old rabbit holes again. And so if you ask me what's going to happen, I think that's going to happen.
But then also, it's the saying is, go woke, go broke. And this is the problem, is that if people do this sort of more and more, that basically the arts will gradually make themselves kind of irrelevant, the performing arts. Is that there is a problem there, isn't there?
Well, there's a campaign at the moment to defund the BBC.
Yes.
And that is gaining traction. I mean, 5 years ago, you never would have given that the time of day. You would have thought, okay, yeah, a few cranks. Now, it's actually a serious proposition, isn't it?
Oh yes, it will happen, I think.
Because the national broadcaster doesn't really speak to the vast majority of people who are, I would suggest, fairly socially conservative. The people who went, especially the people who went, the Red Wall voters, who then went over to the Conservatives in December 2019. I would suggest they're fairly socially conservative. I would suggest many of them, without generalising too much, but I would suggest many of them are Brexit voters. Many of them love their country, I would suggest, as well. And I don't think the BBC speaks for them at all. So the idea of go woke, go broke, the idea that a relatively small percentage of people who have a lot of power, there's another word that they like, and who kind of dominate the institutions, are removing themselves actually from the voters. So you might be right in the sense that, you know, the elections might and campaigns and lobby groups might have a say and things might change. But I can't look into the future. I don't know, but it doesn't look good.
No, I think we're going to see sort of quite big changes, not necessarily for the best, but we remain optimistic.
We do indeed. We do indeed.
Philip, thank you so much for coming on.
Pleasure.
And all the very best. And the campaign you mentioned, Don't Divide Us, is that open to public?
Yeah, I mean, you just go onto the website and there's lots of information there, information about culture, information about education. And there are some statements there which are probably kind of quite interesting. So we come from a position that says we want to combat racism, we want to combat sexism, we want to combat all of these isms and phobias. But how do we do that? How do we do that in a way that isn't identitarian? How do we do that in a way that doesn't kind of call on what Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay call in their new book cynical theories? How do we deal with the actual issue at hand rather than imposing postmodern theory on it?
Right.
So I think in lots and lots of ways, yes, just to go back to what you said, I think in lots of ways we should be fairly optimistic because that is happening, and I think you know, if people look at the website, you know, and have a look what's going on there, they can get involved in various ways as well.
Right. And I think there was also Claire Fox was one of the signatories to a letter that Don't Divide Us did, didn't it?
So Claire Fox, Konstantin Kiszely, who I think is your friend, and lots of other kind of public figures and senior education figures as well. So there are quite a few interesting names there, and I think it's a really exciting campaign.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
That's it for this week. Do remember as well that we have the campaign to save our statues, which Philip wrote about as well in Spiked. And please do subscribe, don't you? I mean, we've actually had a huge response to it, I'm very pleased to say. saveourstatues.org.uk. And we shall see you next week. So thank you very much.